Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to rise today to discuss the motion put out by the official opposition in relation to a COVID inquiry. I guess I'll start by, when we look back at the history, and the Leader of the Opposition, I think, did a very good job at the time frames of what happened and when it happened to kind of remind all of us and to paint a picture of what took place when this all started. And I remember when this first began, discussing with the Premier about a COVID Cabinet Committee, an all-party COVID Cabinet Committee, and I know he had reached out to the other party leaders as well. And I thought to myself, there's no better time to really put all the politics aside and come together as different party leaders to try to find some insight, try to offer some debate, some discussion around how to deal with this pandemic. Now, at that time, I don't think any of us realized that this was going to be as long and as drawn out as it has been. I know when at the early stages of the pandemic, the hope was the vaccines would come out and at some point put an end to the pandemic as a whole. Of course, we now understand that that's not going to happen, that the vaccines, although effective, are not able to stamp out this pandemic altogether. But nonetheless, to have a say at the COVID Cabinet Committee was very important. And I guess it's important for the public to understand as well how crucial that committee was, and to understand what the committee was and what it was not. First off, the COVID Cabinet Committee was not a final decision maker. We were a recommending body. We simply took the information, discussed the information, debated it at times, and went with a consensus to recommend to Cabinet. But ultimately, it was Cabinet's final decision on which way to go with mitigating measures based on public health recommendations and the recommendations of the All-Party COVID Cabinet Committee. So we never were a final decision-making body. And there were times in the last year and a half where I personally have had to straddle the line between what I was able to bring to the table of the COVID Cabinet Committee, what I'm still bringing to the table, and what I maybe disagreed with, that I felt it important that the public understand where I was coming from on that angle, and that can be tricky because we are bound by Cabinet confidentiality as part of that committee, and I never wanted to breach that. I always wanted to be respectful of that, but I also had a role to play as an opposition leader at times to say, look, I disagree with a certain decision or a certain direction that government was making. And I know it was just not too long ago where the other two party leaders made the decision to step down from that all-party Cabinet Committee. I have to say I found that disappointing because we all bring a different element to the table. And I find sometimes government or any organization, it's easy to get in a bubble and everybody starts thinking the same, and you lose the opportunity to have an outside voice or an outside viewpoint to be able to interject into that bubble of thinking. And I honestly believe the All-Party Cabinet Committee, with all of us on there, gave that diversity of thought and thinking to an issue that is so critically important as a pandemic. And again, we were not always in agreement. There were times decisions were made where I just didn't agree with them. And I know there were other decisions that made the other party leaders didn't agree with them. But we decided up until just shortly to stick with it and to ensure that there is a good diverse viewpoints to how to deal with COVID. So I remain on that COVID Cabinet Committee to this day, and I did it because I made the decision that I can either sit on the sidewalk, and criticize, or I can be at the table and at least have a voice. Even if I don't always win every debate or every battle, at least my voice is there to try to bring that different, that different viewpoint to the committee. So, in relation specific to the motion, as other members have said here today, I don't think anybody can reasonably say it's not a legitimate or credible motion, that the motion doesn't have merit, because indeed it does. I have said for quite some time that when this pandemic ends, there needs to be a thorough investigation or review or commission, whatever you want to call it, into how government and public health, and even the COVID Cabinet Committee, which again I'm part of, to be able to see what was done right, what was done wrong, where did we hit it right, where was there a miss. And again, it's not for finger pointing or to blame, because this is new to everybody, whether it's public health or the Department of Health or government. This was completely unprecedented in trying to understand it. Now we're further ahead now. We should be understanding it a whole lot better than we did a year and a half ago, of course, because time teaches us many valuable lessons. But the question is whether we enact on those valuable lessons that we should be taught over that time frame. So an inquiry, absolutely. Absolutely makes sense. You know, I mean, questions need to be asked is, you know, what was done with long-term care homes? Was it appropriate? What was done with our schools? Was it appropriate? Public policy, whether we're talking about lockdowns, yellow zone, orange zone, red zone, the rules surrounding all the different stages of the level of emergency. You know, there's a lot of questions, legitimate questions, that need to be asked. And what I would like to see is actually a broader approach to beyond this motion, is to have something in legislation that will clearly define, whenever the province goes into a state of emergency, that it automatically triggers some sort of inquiry or debriefing, or some sort of aspect where an outside body can look at the decisions that were made during the state of emergency, because it holds government accountable. States of emergency gives government unquestionable power in many regards, and it's there for a reason. You know, I'm not here to debate whether it's good or bad. It's there for a reason. But there has to be, in a democratic system, a knowledge and understanding in the minds of government officials and cabinet to know that someday there is going to be some sort of inquiry, some sort of commission struck that's going to look back, hindsight, at the decisions that were made. And it just helps keep them accountable even in the middle of a state of emergency. So again, I support the inquiry. I think it's a good thing. I'm worried about timing, if I can be honest, simply because an inquiry takes up a lot of resources. And an inquiry interjects into a lot of departments that are already stretched to the max just trying to contain the virus. I'm thinking of how many times the inquiry would have to go to the Department of Health and find data, and then, you know, employees would have to get that data and get that information together to present to the inquiry group. The other one is public health. You know, they're already stretched to the max, contact tracing, testing, doing all they can to get the vaccinations rolled out, and all that entails. I would hate to have them pull back from that important work to have to deal with an inquiry. So while I support an inquiry, I think timing is paramount, and we have to do it in a way that we are not pulling resources out of public health and Department of Health to have the inquiry. So again, I support it. I think it's a good motion. I would hope all members in the House would support it. I think it's very legitimate, certainly holds merit. The only thing I would say, again, is just on when that inquiry is held and the details of it, just to ensure at the end of the day that it doesn't interject into the important work that's being done.
Thank you, member.
Now.